The day my mother-in-law discovered I'd used her $10,000 bribe to pay for my wedding to her son, her face went white as fresh snow. She stood there in my perfectly appointed living room, surrounded by Chicago's social elite, watching them toast my marriage while knowing she'd literally funded the union she'd tried to destroy. Her hands trembled as she held her champagne glass, probably calculating how spectacularly her plan had backfired. 28 years later, she was still paying for that mistake. But that moment of pure shock on her face, that was worth every sleepless night, every social lesson I'd forced myself to learn, every carefully calculated move in the chess game she'd started. You see, Eleanor Matthews thought she was dealing with some small-town nurse who'd fold under pressure. What she got instead was a woman who'd turn her own weapon against her for 3 decades. But you won't believe how this all started. How one rainy night changed everything, and how the cruelest betrayal became the foundation for the perfect revenge. If you're new to Revenge with Love, you're about to witness why patience and strategy beat petty payback every single time. Hit that subscribe button because this story will show you that sometimes the sweetest revenge is becoming everything your enemies swore you'd never be. My name is Eleanor Matthews, and this is how I made my mother-in-law's worst nightmare come true. It was 28 years ago when I was just Sarah Collins, a 26-year-old nurse from small-town Indiana who'd moved to Chicago with more dreams than money. I'd been dating David Matthews for 2 years, this brilliant lawyer with gentle hands and kind eyes who'd represented everything I'd never known I wanted. The problem was, David came with Eleanor Matthews attached. I should have known what I was dealing with the first time we met. It was Thanksgiving at their Winnicott mansion, the kind of place that whispered old money and older prejudices. Eleanor opened the door wearing a burgundy dress that cost more than my car, her silver hair styled in a chignon that looked carved from marble. She hugged David with practiced maternal warmth, then her gaze settled on me. For just a fraction of a second, so brief, I almost missed it, her smile vanished completely. And you must be the nurse. Not Sarah, not David's girlfriend, the nurse. Like my profession defined my worth as a human being. But then her smile returned, bright and welcoming, and she pulled me into what felt like a genuine embrace. The performance was flawless. The evening proceeded smoothly enough. Eleanor played the perfect hostess, keeping my wine glass full, asking polite questions about my background. But I felt her watching me, studying me like I was a specimen under glass. It wasn't until I excused myself to use the bathroom that I overheard the conversation that would define the next 30 years of our lives. "She's lovely, Mom," David was saying, in the kitchen, his voice carrying that tone he used when trying to convince someone. "I'm sure she's very nice, darling, but have you thought about what you really want? Long term. She's from some little town in Indiana. No family connections, no education beyond that nursing program." My heart hammered against my ribs as I pressed myself against the hallway wall. "Are you sure you're not just having fun?" "Mom, what are you saying? Sarah's intelligent. She's kind." "I'm not questioning her character, David. But you're going to be a partner someday, possibly in politics. You need someone who can move in those circles, someone who understands our world. This girl, is she really partner material?" Partner material. The words hit like a slap. "I love her, Mom." "Of course you do, darling. But love isn't always enough. Sometimes we have to make practical choices." I returned to dinner with a smile plastered on my face, but something fundamental had shifted. I'd seen behind Eleanor's mask, and what I'd found there would require very careful handling. Over the next 18 months, as David and I moved toward engagement, Eleanor launched psychological warfare. It was subtle, sophisticated, utterly ruthless. At family gatherings, she'd seat me next to David's cousin's wife, a former debutante with 3 languages and a Vassar degree. The comparison was never stated, but it hung in the air like expensive perfume. Eleanor would ask about my work with bright, patronizing interest. "How wonderful that you help people. It must be so fulfilling to do something so hands-on." The way she said hands-on made it sound vaguely distasteful. She'd comment on my clothes with faint praise that cut like razor wire. "What a lovely dress, dear. So colorful. You have such individual taste." She'd ask about my family with pointed curiosity. "Your father was a mechanic. How interesting. What does your mother do?" When I mentioned my mother worked part-time at the library, Eleanor would nod with a smile that suggested this confirmed every suspicion. The worst part was how she'd transform when David entered the room, becoming warm and maternal, asking about my day with apparent concern. David would beam, pleased his mother and girlfriend were bonding so well. I felt like I was losing my mind. Eleanor's campaign intensified after David proposed. She'd call him at work to share articles about successful lawyers marrying within their social circles. She'd invite David to events, mentioning that I probably wouldn't enjoy them. They were rather stuffy for someone of my background. Each comment was perfectly crafted to make David question not my character, but my suitability for his world. And slowly, terrifyingly, I began to see those doubts reflected in his eyes. But Eleanor's masterpiece was still coming. It was a rainy Thursday in April when everything changed. I was at David's apartment cooking dinner when Eleanor arrived unexpectedly, letting herself in with her key. "Sarah, dear, what a surprise! David didn't mention you'd be here." I emerged from the kitchen, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "He's working late. I thought I'd make sure he had dinner waiting." "That's thoughtful," Eleanor said, though her tone suggested thoughtfulness was rather pitiful. "I came to drop off information about the Fairmont. I managed to secure a date in September." She studied me with that clinical gaze I'd come to dread. "You know, dear, you look tired. This wedding planning must be overwhelming, especially when you're not used to—" She gestured vaguely at David's expensive apartment. "I'm managing fine." "Of course you are. You're a strong girl. You'd have to be working in a hospital. But strength isn't the same as suitability, is it?" Eleanor moved to the window, gazing out at the rain with casual authority that made every space feel like her domain. "I've been thinking about our lunch conversation. I wonder if I wasn't clear enough about my concerns. You see, I don't dislike you, Sarah. Quite the opposite. I think you're a fine person who deserves to be truly happy." "I am happy. David makes me happy." "Does he? Or does the idea of David make you happy? The fantasy of the life you might have?" The question stung because there was just enough truth in it to hurt. I love David for who he is.
I'm sure you believe that, but love built on fantasies rarely survives reality. And the reality is that you'll never truly belong in David's world. You'll always be performing, always trying to catch up, always feeling like you're not quite enough. Eleanor's voice dropped to something almost conspiratorial. "I see how hard you're trying already. The way you research topics before family dinners, the way you choose your words so carefully around us. It must be exhausting." It was exhausting, though I'd never admitted that to anyone. The constant vigilance,
The fear of revealing my ignorance about David's world. It followed me everywhere. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because you're smart enough to deserve better than a lifetime of feeling inadequate. And because I love my son too much to watch him struggle with a marriage doomed from the start. She moved to her purse, withdrawing a manila envelope that she placed on the coffee table with deliberate precision. I have a proposition, one that could benefit everyone involved. I stared at the envelope, ice forming in my stomach. What kind of proposition? $10,000, Eleanor said simply, in exchange for ending your engagement and returning to Indiana. Tonight. The words seemed to hang in impossible air. Blood drained from my face as the full meaning hit me. You're offering me money to leave your son. I'm offering you a fresh start. $10,000 is enough to pay off your student loans, set yourself up somewhere new, maybe go back to school. You could have the life you're meant to have instead of trying to force yourself into one that will never fit. I sank into David's armchair, legs unable to support my weight. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. And I'm being more than fair. $10,000 is more money than you've ever had at once, isn't it? More than you'd save in years of marriage to David once you factor in the expectations and expenses. Eleanor sat across from me, leaning forward with earnest concern that was somehow more insulting than outright hostility. Think rationally, dear. You're 26, attractive, you have a decent career. You could meet someone tomorrow who'd worship the ground you walk on, someone who wouldn't require you to change everything about yourself. The clinical precision was breathtaking. She'd identified every insecurity and weaponized them with surgical skill. David would never forgive you if he knew about this. David will never know, Eleanor replied with absolute confidence, because you're going to leave him a letter explaining that you've realized you're not ready for marriage, that you need to go home and figure out what you want. He'll be hurt, but he'll recover. Eventually, he'll meet someone more appropriate and realize everything worked out for the best. She stood, smoothing her skirt with practiced efficiency. I'm leaving this envelope here. You have until tomorrow morning to decide. If you take it, I expect you gone from Chicago by tomorrow night. If you don't, well, we both know how this ends. You'll marry David, struggle to fit in, make each other miserable, and eventually divorce. The difference is that by then you'll be older, more damaged, and you won't have $10,000 to start over. Eleanor gathered her belongings, pausing at the door for her final blow. David deserves better than a wife who's constantly afraid she's not good enough, and you deserve better than a lifetime of feeling like an imposter. This is the kindest solution for everyone. Then she was gone, leaving me alone with her money and the wreckage of my world. I sat staring at that envelope for hours, feeling something fundamental shift inside my chest. The humiliation was overwhelming. The assumption that my love could be purchased, that my relationship was somehow fraudulent. But beneath the humiliation was something else, something harder and infinitely more dangerous. Rage. Not the explosive kind that burns out quickly, but the cold, calculating variety that settles into your bones and changes everything. Eleanor Matthews had made a critical error. She'd seen the nursing scrubs and modest background and assumed she was dealing with someone weak. She'd been catastrophically wrong. When David came home that night, exhausted from working late, I was sitting calmly on his couch. The money envelope was nowhere to be seen. I served him dinner, listened to his day, and when he asked about his mother's visit, I smiled and said she'd dropped off wedding venue information. She's really going all out, David said with fond exasperation. I hope she's not being too overwhelming. Not at all, I replied. Eleanor Matthews was no longer overwhelming. She was simply a problem to be solved with methodical precision. That night, after David fell asleep, I lay awake planning. Not petty revenge that would hurt everyone, but something elegant. Something that would give Eleanor exactly what she deserved while protecting the man I loved. The plan crystallized over several sleepless nights. It was beautifully simple and relied entirely on Eleanor's own assumptions about my character. On Friday morning, exactly 24 hours after her ultimatum, I drove to her Winnetka mansion. I wore my best dress and took particular care for my appearance. Eleanor answered the door in gardening clothes, hands dirty from her prize roses. She looked genuinely surprised, and for just a moment, her composure slipped. "Sarah, I wasn't expecting." "I came to accept your offer," I said simply.
Eleanor's face cycled through surprise, relief, and something that almost looked like disappointment, as if she'd secretly hoped I'd fight back. "I see," she said finally, stepping back. "I think you're making the right choice. For everyone." "I think so too," I agreed, though not in the way she assumed. She led me to the living room, where I'd first overheard that conversation about being partner material. The irony was perfect. "I have the money here," Eleanor said, retrieving the envelope from an antique desk. $10,000, as promised. Cash. No paper trail." She handed it to me with the satisfied expression of a successful businesswoman. I took it, noting its weight. "You understand the terms. Leave Chicago tonight. Don't contact David. Let him believe you realized you weren't ready for marriage. I understand perfectly. I've drafted a letter for you to leave him. Nothing dramatic, just a simple explanation that you need time to think." She handed me expensive stationery with paragraphs in her precise handwriting. I read it over, noting how perfectly it was crafted to wound David's ego while making me appear flighty and immature. This is very thorough. I want to make the transition as easy as possible for David. A clean break is always best. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my purse, with the money. Standing, I extended my hand with a smile that was entirely genuine. "Thank you, Eleanor. This has been very illuminating." She shook my hand, looking slightly puzzled, but clearly relieved the unpleasant business was finished. "I hope you find happiness, dear." "Oh, I will," I assured her. "Very happy indeed." That afternoon, I deposited Eleanor's $10,000 into my checking account. I kept the receipt and her letter in a safety deposit box I rented specifically for the purpose. Then, I called David at work. "Can you come over tonight? There's something important I want to discuss." When David arrived that evening, I was waiting with champagne and takeout from his favorite restaurant. I was glowing with barely contained excitement. "What's all this about?" he asked, delighted by my obvious happiness. I took his hands and looked into his eyes. "David Matthews, will you marry me tonight?" His mouth fell open. "What? Sarah, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about eloping, right now, tonight. We can drive to Vegas or find a justice of peace here. I don't care about the big wedding, the fancy reception, any of it. I just want to be your wife." "But the plans? The venue your mother booked?" "Forget all that," I said, pulling him closer. "I realize today that none of it matters. What matters is us, our love, our commitment. Everything else is just noise." David stared at me, then broke into the biggest smile I'd ever seen. "Are you serious? You want to elope tonight?" "Dead serious. Unless you're having second thoughts?" "Are you kidding? I've been dreaming about marrying you since our third date. I don't care if we get married in a gas station, as long as you're my wife." We were married 6 hours later by a judge whose wife had roused him from bed for the emergency ceremony. I wore my navy dress. David wore his work suit with the tie loosened. We had no rings except my engagement ring. No flowers except ones from a 24-hour grocery store.
no witnesses except the judge's wife and a night shift bailiff. It was perfect. We spent our wedding night in David's apartment, too giddy to sleep. When we called our parents the next morning, my family was confused but delighted. David's parents were less enthusiastic. "Eloped," Harold Matthews said carefully over speakerphone. "Well, that's unexpected." "Is Sarah pregnant?" Eleanor asked bluntly. I bit my lip to keep from laughing. "No, Mom, she's not pregnant. We just decided we didn't want to wait. We love each other." Long pause before Eleanor spoke again, her voice strained. "Well, I suppose congratulations are in order." "We're very happy," I said sweetly. "It feels wonderful to finally be part of the family." After we hung up, David spun me around his living room. "I can't believe you're my wife, Mrs. Sarah Matthews." God, I loved the sound of that. And I did love it. But what I loved most was knowing that Eleanor's $10,000, her attempt to buy me off, was now sitting in our joint account, helping pay for our honeymoon and first apartment as a married couple. The irony was delicious. Eleanor had literally funded the marriage she'd tried to prevent. But that was just the opening move. The real masterpiece would unfold over years as I systematically became everything she'd sworn I could never be. This is exactly what Revenge with Love is about, showing that when someone tries to destroy your dreams, sometimes the perfect response is using their own weapons to build something even better. Make sure you're subscribed because what happened next proves that patience and intelligence trump cruelty every single time. I threw myself into mastering Eleanor's world with the focused intensity I'd once brought to medical school. I joined the Junior League, not because I cared about their charity work, but because Eleanor chaired their biggest fundraiser. I learned which wines paired with which courses, not from natural interest, but because Eleanor had once suggested I was too unsophisticated for David's social circles. Every skill Eleanor implied was beyond me became my obsession. I studied art history so I could discuss the pieces at gallery openings. I learned French so I could converse with the European clients at David's firm events. I memorized the social registry so I'd know exactly who everyone was and why they mattered. The transformation wasn't easy. I spent nights reading etiquette books and weekends at cultural events, forcing myself to develop interests that had never come naturally. But every awkward moment, every social misstep I corrected, every small victory in Eleanor's arena was fuel for the fire she'd lit. When David made partner 2 years ahead of schedule, I was right there beside him, charming judges and entertaining clients with the kind of effortless grace that comes from desperate determination rather than inherited privilege. I planned firm parties that became legendary for their elegance. I organized charity auctions that raised record amounts. I gave dinner parties that had Chicago's legal and social elite competing for invitations. And through it all, Eleanor watched. She watched me succeed in every area where she'd predicted failure. She watched her son grow more successful and happy with each passing year. She watched our children thrive under my careful attention. When we bought our house in Lincoln Park, a stunning Victorian that cost twice what Eleanor's mansion was worth, I made sure to hire the same caterer who'd worked her most recent charity event. The caterers mentioned, quite casually, how much more elegant our housewarming was compared to the rather stuffy affair they'd done the week before. Eleanor attended that party, standing in my perfectly appointed living room surrounded by Chicago's elite, watching them compliment my taste and intelligence and obvious devotion to her son. I caught her studying me that night with her old clinical gaze. But now there was something new in her expression. Confusion. And perhaps, just perhaps, a hint of respect. When Emma was born, Eleanor offered to throw the baby shower. I accepted graciously. then spent the entire event watching her play devoted grandmother while guests praised my parenting philosophy and admired the nursery I'd designed. Sarah has such wonderful instincts. David's so fortunate. I'd smile and thank her, thinking about that night when she'd told me I deserved a smaller life. The years passed. Our marriage grew stronger. David's career flourished, partly because he had a wife who moved seamlessly through his professional world, who remembered clients' children's names and never embarrassed him at events. We had Michael 3 years after Emma, bought a lake house, traveled to Europe every summer, and Eleanor watched it all. Watched me exceed every limitation she'd tried to place on my life. Most importantly, I never once mentioned our conversation that April night. Never hinted that she'd tried to buy me off. Never suggested her acceptance was anything other than natural maternal adjustment. I let her believe her secret was safe, even as I used her own weapon against her in ways she was too proud to acknowledge. At family dinners, I'd mention casually how fortunate we'd been to have that unexpected money early in our marriage, the windfall that had helped us get started. Eleanor would stiffen slightly, but she could never ask where the money came from without revealing her role. When Emma started at Northwestern, Eleanor's own alma mater, I made sure to mention that the tuition check came from our early marriage nest egg. Eleanor watched her granddaughter receive the education she'd once suggested was beyond my children's reach, paid for with the very money she'd used to try to drive me away. But the final, perfect stroke came last year, when David was diagnosed with prostate cancer. For a few terrifying months, we faced losing him. Eleanor was genuinely devastated, her perfect composure cracking to reveal the frightened mother underneath. She called me one evening, voice shaking. "Sarah, I don't know how to help him." "You love him," I said simply. "That's enough." Long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I'm so glad he has you. I'm so glad that you stayed." The words hung between us, heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. She was thinking about that night 28 years ago, about the choice she'd tried to force on me. "Where else would I be?" I asked gently. "This is my family." During David's treatment, I managed his medications, coordinated with doctors, took medical leave to care for him full-time. Eleanor watched me tend her son with the same careful attention I'd once given hospital patients. And I think that's when she finally understood who she'd tried to drive away. At David's 5-year survival celebration last month, Eleanor stood to give a toast. She looked around the table at our children and grandchildren, at the life we'd built. And for the first time in 30 years, she looked at me with something approaching admiration. "To Sarah," she said, raising her glass, "the best thing that ever happened to our family." David beamed, thinking his mother was simply acknowledging what he'd always known. But I caught the subtext. She was apologizing, in the only way her pride would allow, for ever thinking I wasn't good enough. I raised my own glass, smiling at the woman who'd tried to destroy my happiness and instead given me the tools to build something even stronger. "To family," I replied, "to the choices that define us and the love that sustains us." Later that evening, David pulled me close in our kitchen. 28 years, and I still can't believe you chose me." I kissed him, thinking about a manila envelope and a bitter woman's failed attempt to buy my love away. "I'll always choose you. Always." Because that's what real love does. It doesn't bend when challenged. It doesn't let others' limitations define its potential. And sometimes, when someone tries to destroy it, real love becomes something even more powerful than they could have imagined. That's the kind of strategic long-term revenge we celebrate here at Revenge with Love. Not destruction, but transformation. Not getting even, but getting better. Eleanor thought she was removing an obstacle from her son's path. Instead, she created the perfect wife for him, forged in the fire of her own cruelty. If this story restored your faith that intelligence and patience can triumph over prejudice and manipulation, smash that like button and subscribe. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't making your enemies suffer. It's making them watch you succeed beyond their wildest fears while knowing they're the ones who made it possible. Eleanor's $10,000 didn't buy my absence from David's life. It bought 28 years of watching me become everything she'd sworn I could never be, funded by her own hand. And every time she looks at our beautiful family, our successful marriage, our thriving children, she knows the truth. Her worst enemy wasn't some small-town nurse who wasn't good enough for her son. Her worst enemy was her own arrogance. And that enemy won.